Hi, my name is Allie King, and today I'm going to be walking you through my interactive module planning template. So this is for the lesson Hamilton versus History, a look into the American Revolution using Hamilton the Musical. This was designed using Indiana State Standards for 8th grade social studies students. The American Revolution is something they study, and this is meant to be a standalone module. This is not something that you would use to teach the American Revolution in its entirety. So the first objective is you are meeting the characters from Hamilton, and the students will create a mind map to make connections. So I have some points here. The main point being students will be introduced to the musical Hamilton, including the characters specifically. And then there's no assessment there. That's more of a teacher introduction. The first subpoint, the students will create a web connecting the characters that appear in the musical, and we'll use Popplet as that tool. It can connect the characters in a great way. This module, their final product will be a Padlet, and so they're going to be taking a lot of the different products that they've created throughout this module, and they'll be linking it to a Padlet to present at the end of the module. So every time you see a carrot, it'll explain that that's what is happening. That the Popplet is the main item, but it will be linked to a Padlet in the end. So every time Padlet shows up under the technology integration, that's what that is for. They're not actually creating a Padlet each time. They are just going to be using that tool to link all their final products together. So students will create a Popplet with the characters, and down here we'll be adding to that Popplet. They will need to distinguish between family, rival, or ally within their Popplet. So they'll look at the different characters from Hamilton and decide, did this person help Hamilton, or did they try and hinder him as much as possible? The last subpoint was the conflict each character was facing. So George Washington had his own conflict. Lafayette had his own conflict, and the students will need to distinguish what was their biggest fighting point. And this will be something that the teacher will also help instruct, and so there's no assessment here, as you can see in the assessment column. For learning objective 2, they're going to be looking at Alexander Hamilton and the timeline of events that happen within the musical. As stated earlier, this is a standalone module. Not every single important event that happened in the American Revolution is brought up during this musical, but the students need to be able to pick out which ones were important and which ones were mentioned. The teacher will be introducing the different events using Edpuzzle, and there'll be 5 questions within the Edpuzzle for the students to answer as just a quick assessment for the teacher. The students will be using timeline.nightlab.com, and this is a very interactive timeline tool, and the students will need to take the events that were mentioned by the teacher, and they'll have to do some research and analyze these events and plug them in to Timeline Night Lab and put them in the correct order. And then will also be linked to the Padlet. So they'll need to create a timeline with dates in chronological order, and they will need to include the setting, event, cause and effect of the event, and the date of the event. So those are the big important details I want the students to research during this activity. If you come down here, another addition for subpoint 2, which events were turning points to the Revolution specifically? So not to Alexander Hamilton's life necessarily, but to the Revolution. And so the students will also need to include those speaking points within their Timeline Night Lab. And then once again, it will be connected to their Padlet. The last point is what events were turning points in Alexander's life. So which ones really turned his life around? There were some very important events that kind of changed Alexander's path politically and personally. So the students need to be able to respond to this question, and they can just make that into a response through their Padlet. There really is not another tool that is necessary for this subpoint. Moving on to learning objective 3, the students will need to look at why Lin-Manuel Miranda, the creator of Hamilton, chose a very distinctive original cast. They're very diverse, and they do not, their nationalities don't line up with the historical figures. And so why was that a point that Lin-Manuel Miranda needed to make. And so this is what will be addressed in this learning objective. For the main point, students will learn the nationalities of the historical figures. The teacher will lead this point using an Animoto, which has already been created. Subpoint 1, students will compare the historic nationalities to the nationalities of the cast, the original cast. And so we will use a pictochart. A teacher will create a pictochart for the students to make that comparison so it is easily seen. These two do not have assessments because they are presented by the teacher. Subpoint 2, why did Lin make this choice in his original cast? This is where the thought process is going to come in. I want the students to make a Canva to reflect on this, and so it's going to be a reflection piece. But they can use Canva, and they can use graphics, backgrounds in Canva, and make a very powerful infographic. And I want them to link that or upload it into their Padlet, into their final Padlet. Students will need to answer the question proposed in this question, and that's basically it. For the last subpoint for this learning objective, the students need to agree with this move. Would you have done it differently? And this is an opinion question, and there's obviously no points for either response, but I want the students to think about how they would have done it. Would they have casted individuals that were close to the historic figures, or do they love how Lin-Manuel Miranda chose this direction? This is just a response piece that I think would be interesting for them to put into their Padlet, and it can be written within Padlet. For learning objective 4, we will be looking at Alexander Hamilton's successes throughout the American Revolution. The main point that will be led by the teacher is the students will need to learn the definition of legacy. So what kind of things are we talking about? There's some things that would not qualify if we are trying to define a legacy within Alexander Hamilton's life. So the students will learn a little bit more how to make that distinction. The main point that I want the students to take away here is they are going to be using a video authoring tool of their choice. Could be WeVideo if they're using Chromebooks, or iMovie, something in that realm. They'll be using a tool of their choice, and they'll be talking about Alexander Hamilton's most lasting legacies, and they'll be picking 3 of their choice. So it could be different within among students. So they will need to create this movie and then upload it or send a YouTube link to their Padlet. And here in the assessment talks a little bit more about that. The second point that they need to also do is they need to make sure that they are including different details about the legacy. So not just naming the legacies, but then also explaining more about what those events were. And they will also be including that within their video. Subpoint 3 that they will also need to include within their video is to support their opinion if these things would have happened if Alexander Hamilton had not taken over. Was there someone who thought similar to Alexander Hamilton that still could have pushed these different initiatives, would have set up the Treasury the way it is now? That is kind of what I want the students to think about. Or was Alexander Hamilton just a turning point in these different events? For the last objective, they're going to be looking, the students will be looking at drama and really looking into theater. Hamilton is full of purposeful dramatization, so a lot of the things are not accurate. And so the students will be learning a little bit more about that. So the main point the teacher will lead is what are some of these false statements within Hamilton? And the teacher will create a list of those. It might not be an exhaustive list, but it'll be quite a few of these points. The subpoint that the students will use is, were most of these inaccuracies or just exaggerated points? So they'll go into idea boards, which is basically it's an online board, and you can use Post-it notes to in different categories to sort your thoughts. So I want the students to be able to do that, and they'll have an accuracy and an inaccuracy column, and then an exaggerated column, and they'll move some of these ideas into the proper categories. For subpoint 2, they'll be moving to Padlet. What is the purpose of using these exaggerations or inaccuracies? For subpoint 2, they'll be going back to Padlet, and the question that they will be answering is, what is the purpose of using these exaggerations or inaccuracies? So the students will think about different movies such as Alexander or Titanic or Les Miserables, and they will look at these movies and see how dramatization played a part in these movies, yet they were still historical occurrences, and they will decide what the purpose of this was. And for subpoint 3, the students will be going back to Padlet, and they will need to give their opinion on some of these statements. Were they significant? Would the musical have been better to not have them? They will give an opinion on what they think was well placed or maybe could have been left out, and they will be responding through Padlet. So I also included a final column, and it explains more about what the final assessment. So I will use a checklist to assess the final Padlet. Each element will be worth 10. So their linked Padlet onto their Padlet is worth 10 points. Timeline with response is 20 points for that learning objective. The Canva with a response is worth 20. The video is worth 10. The link with the idea boards and the 2 responses are worth 30. And just a well-designed Padlet with basic information including a title, a student name, and description is worth 10, making the whole project 100 points. So I hope that is not confusing, but this is just a little bit more of a breakdown of my final assessment. So we come down here, my content resources, what resources we'll be using to develop. I'll be using Storyline or PowerPoint. The decision's not made, it just comes down to financials. To develop the module, I'll be making a teacher curated or created sources for the module, including Animoto, YouTube, Pictochart, and iMovie. So these are kind of what I will use to create it. There's so many different options for technology tools. Storyline, PowerPoint are different items. Padlet, Creately, Padlet, Timeline, NightLab, Pictochart, WeVideo, iMovie, Idea Boards, YouTube. Google Slides is an option, and Animoto are also different tools that the students will be using. So once again, the things in red are items that I have not decided on, but we'll make those decisions while developing the module. And that is my template in its entirety. And I'm very excited. I think that the students, there's enough passive moments where students are just taking in information, but they're also interacting and doing a lot of creating as well. So I'm very excited about this opportunity for these students, and I look forward to making it. Thank you.